My name is Thomas Church. This is a record of our journey in search of the lost continent of Mu, a catalog of our experiences to date. Eventually, I hope that you'll follow along with me as we continue onward from here. I'd like you, the listener, to join me on this adventure, and with me, bear witness to the dawning of Mu. Arriving home on a cool early spring day, I picked up a stack of letters left for me at the top of the stairs leading down to my basement apartment. Stepping into my rundown studio, I made my way to the trash can and started my ritual disposal of junk mail. Occasionally a bill found its way into the trash. I could skirt by for one more month without them cutting me off. At the end of the pile, I found an envelope addressed to me, Thomas J. Church. It caught my attention for a number of reasons. The envelope was thick and had the feel of hard graininess that only the more expensive cardstock possessed. Its return address, handwritten in an elegant script, listed somewhere in the UK. Barring a quick trip to Canada a few years back, I've not had much global interaction outside of New Jersey. The last bit that caught my attention was the name, Thomas J. Church. Up until now, I didn't know I had a middle name. My curiosity did not win over my hunger, so I made a quick sandwich of cold cuts and settled down at my antiquated computer, placing the letter on my desk. I checked my email, hoping that the latest article I'd written was accepted from one of the 10 or so magazines I'd sent it to. I looked. Nothing. A little over a year ago, I'd finally moved into this apartment on my own after a long string of roommates, dorms, and even a brief stint of homelessness. I had been managing so far, picking up small, inconsequential jobs, all the while supplementing my meager income by writing short stories and submitting them to magazines. I never made quite enough to live off of, but it supplemented my 9-to-5 and kept me in food and gas. Even though I was finally leading a steady, if somewhat modest lifestyle, I increasingly grew discomforted living here. There was a depth to the quiet around me. I found myself leaving my TV on at all times to drown out the oppressive silence. I'd always lived with others, even when those others were strangers. The proximity of other humans was a weak substitute for actual companionship, but it was still more than I'd had now. And in my solitude, I found that the silence was a company of its own. A company that I dreaded. The shadows grew longer in the corners, and I'd find that whenever I was walking in darker areas, I'd move faster to get to my destination. It was probably a comical sight, a grown man power-walking around the outside of his house at night just to throw out his garbage. I'd never had a fear of the dark, but the longer I stayed here, the more it felt like something was catching up to me. It was then, when I was contemplating the ramifications of leaving a steady job and lifestyle to pick up and set off again, when I decided to open the letter. I'd opened it up, scanned the contents, and concluded that once again I'd been duped. Cardstock or no, this was obviously another piece of junk mail. I looked over the enclosed airline ticket, trying to find the fine print that listed it as some investment opportunity, or how it was just an example of one of the many fabulous prizes I qualified to win. But I couldn't find the disclaimer. I checked through the documents again, reading the headlines. A hotel reservation, directions, what looked like 2 ATM cards, and finally, a letter. From the offices of Metro and Associates. Hold on. Let me try to read this in my terrible British accent. From the offices of Metro and Associates. Dear Mr. Church, our firm, Metro and Associates, having been retained to manage the estate of James Churchward, and in acknowledgment of his instructions, are hereby acknowledging you, Thomas Javier Church, with regard to the inheritance you are entitled to. Information will be disclosed at the probate meeting set on the 15th of March. Details are enclosed. All accommodations have been provided for you in advance of the meeting. Prepaid debit cards have been provided for you in the amounts of $10,000 and £10,000 respectively, with further accommodations to be furnished after the meeting's terms. Please plan for at least a 2-month excursion. Sincerely, Callum Digby, Esquire. I sat in a numbed shock. The skeptical part of my brain kept screaming at me that this was all just another hoax, a Nigerian prince desperate to offload his riches to some random stranger. But still, if this was a hoax, it was really well done. And if this was some kind of con, wouldn't they be targeting someone that actually had money? And yet, if it was real, then a myriad of questions crashed into my conscience like the keys of a vintage typewriter jamming any rational thought from a page. Who was James Churchward? And was he really related to me? And what's up with Javier? I'm part Hispanic? I don't feel Hispanic. Was my father's name Javier, or was that just some random crazy decision by my broken mother? I idly played with the debit cards while contemplating my next step. What do you do when faced with the weight of such significant, life-changing news? I decided to drink. Heavily. The next morning I called out of work and brought the papers to a small law office in a strip mall down the street. After some sitting and waiting and a brief meeting that involved more internet searching than talking to me, the lawyer confirmed that Metro and Associates was a legitimate company. The ticket to Exeter was valid, and the $200 charge for services rendered proved that, at the very least, the U.S. debit card was legit. The meeting was set for 2 weeks from now. There in the parking lot of the strip mall, eating a sundae from Baskin-Robbins, I sat on a bench and considered what this would all mean for me. It didn't take long. I still hadn't finished off my first scoop of Jamocha almond fudge before deciding that I was bound for England. The truth was that I had nothing going for me here. Not many friends or family. I was itching to start moving anyway, and, if I was being honest with myself, I just couldn't pass up on the offer. So I went home and scanned my small apartment. It was sparse. I never kept much from my childhood, and what I did I kept in a medium-sized hard-shelled suitcase, a boxed-up life for someone who was always ready for the next destination. I swung by Larry, my landlord, and knocked on his door. I waited, listening as a series of chains rattled and deadbolts shifted. Larry was always the nervous sort. Opening the door a crack and looking out at me, he smiled and pulled the last stopper out of the way, swinging the door open. I discussed the situation briefly with him, and to my surprise, he seemed quite eager for me. We'd never gotten to be friends, but I appreciated the vicarious joy he felt for me, and I decided I'd do well for him. I went to the ATM and pulled out $1,800. Enough to cover 3 months' rent. I told him that he could start looking for a replacement after a month, but to please keep my apartment for the 3. After that, he could throw out, keep, or sell anything in it. I only asked him to keep my suitcase. Larry agreed to the terms. We didn't have a lease or anything greater than a verbal agreement anyway. Finally, he asked me what my plans were now. My flight wasn't leaving for another week. I figured I should probably try to keep some of the cash just in case this all turned out to be a bust. Still, $8,000 was a good deal more than I'd ever had in my life at any given time. My bank account had maybe $30 in it, and I'd been planning on living on ramen until my next check. The next day I went to work and told my boss that I'd be leaving in a week. He definitely didn't react as well as my landlord. I apologized and let him rant about the value of commitment. Honestly, how much commitment could he expect for minimum wage? Outside of that, things kind of fell into place. I spent the rest of the week buying my new wardrobe, suitcases, and eating like a king. I kind of felt like Joe from Joe versus the Volcano when he first discovered he was dying and started the shopping spree for his grand adventure. I contacted a few friends I'd collected and let them know of my plans. They congratulated me and wished me well, but there was no real fanfare. Everyone was busy living their lives. The second to last day I panicked a bit, realizing I'd not figured out what to do with my car. But Larry told me that it would be no problem, and that he can keep it in the garage for as long as I needed. And with that, I was ready to go. I spent my last night in NYC enjoying the luxury of a hotel room, and the next day a taxi took me to Kennedy Airport. Sitting in the terminal, waiting for my flight to board, I noticed a man sitting a few aisles across and to the left of me. He was well-dressed, tall, and had a closely cropped beard. His hair had gone white, not gray or silvery, but the dull white like old bones. He stared straight forward off into the distance, but whenever I looked away, I could see he was staring at me in the periphery of my vision. Maybe we were just eyeballing each other, feeding off the creep vibe that maybe I was myself giving off. Still, though, something about him bothered me. I didn't worry about it at the time, but thinking back I realized it was his stillness. He sat there staring off into nothing, never shifting in his seat, never checking his phone or the changing flight monitors. When I turned away from him, I felt like his entire focus was on me. Yet, whenever I turned to look directly at him, I never caught even the hint of movement. Maybe I was imagining it, because I couldn't exactly distinguish his features when I wasn't looking at him. But I think he hated me. Does that make sense? It's just a feeling I got, like I was some weaker animal standing motionless, submitting to a greater threat. I tried to rationalize it as just flight jitters, but it didn't seem to connect. The actual flight itself didn't bother me any. On the plane, I was seated in a very comfortable reclining chair in the front. My adjacent seat was empty. I'd never sat, in any class on a plane before, let alone first. It definitely lived up to the hype in comfort and amenities. After we'd lifted off the ground and the seat belt lights turned off, I got up and walked to the back. The stewardess recommended the larger, well-appointed bathroom in the front for my use, but I'd complained that I needed to move my legs. I walked down the aisles to the back of the plane and back up, surveying the faces as best I could, but I didn't see the man from the terminal. I sat back down and, still not feeling comfortable, got up and repeated my circuit. Nothing. I'd assumed that once you'd gotten through enough security to get to that gate terminal, that you were destined to be on the plane, but I guess I was wrong. 6 hours into the flight, a steady storm was raging, occasionally lighting the portal windows. The occasional shake reminding me more than anything else that we were propelling through space at several thousands of feet in a vacuum-sealed tin can. The lights in the cabin were dim now, and everyone was either asleep or absorbed in the channel they were watching on the rear of the seat in front of them. I got up and decided to take another walk, this time with the actual purpose of stretching my legs. I walked toward the center of the plane and saw that both restrooms bore the red occupied flag. I stood there, idly looking out the exit hatch window, gazing out into the darkness. Lightning flashed, and there, on the wing, I thought I'd seen the shape of a man, standing still amidst the chaotic whirling of rain and wind, and in the stuttering blindness of the stormlight, he was gone. A small chime dinged, and the sound of a lock slid back as a portly man dressed in a sherbet-colored Hawaiian shirt stepped out. I snapped out of my reverie just about the same time that the smell coming from the open door hit my senses. On second thought, maybe a nice big bathroom in the front would be better. I attributed my vision to tiredness, or darkness, or any number of things that would have been more probable than a man standing stock still on the wing staring back at its inhabitants in the middle of the lightning storm. Clouds? Birds? Something, I don't know. A couple free Jack and Cokes, supplied by a stewardess wearing a mischievous smile, definitely helped unburden me of my concerns. The rest of my trip went without incident, as we landed to the sound of gentle applause from the passengers. I traveled to my hotel, checked in, and spent the remainder of my week acting like any typical sightseer. I had a hotel reserved for me in Exeter, but I decided to take a train out to London for 3 days and see all the sights. Thank God for the debit card. I tried taking out a bit of money when I first arrived and quickly realized that my wallet was definitely the wrong size. The food was surprisingly good. I guess I was living with the preconceived expectations of British food being terrible. Or maybe the money I had available to me was landing me in finer cuisine. I probably was making up for a bit of luxury that I'd never had the chance of fully experiencing up until now. I made my way back to Exeter, and on the 15th a car was sent to pick me up. As we pulled up to the building of Metro & Associates, I finally got to experience the look and feel of what I thought England would be, based off of all my experience watching PBS. Stepping into the foyer, I looked in on a large study. The walls were lined with old books and sconces that made me itch to search for secret passages. Elderly men sat in comfortable-looking high-backed sofas, each sporting a tiny table and tea accompaniment. A large stag's head hung above a fireplace on the far wall alongside the supposed blunderbuss that shot it. This is what I thought England would be. It's almost like they rented out the old men just to make me the image fit perfectly to my perception. I walked up a set of gently spiraling stone stairs, expecting to be received by Lord Grantham himself. But upon being ushered into a sitting room, I was surprised to be introduced to Mr. Digby himself, a well-groomed, honey-brown man of possible Indian descent. He greeted me warmly, offered to get me a beverage, and asked me to take a seat. Sitting down, Mr. Digby, with a startled realization, turned to look behind me and apologetically asked Mr. Kanta if he would like something to drink as well. I was startled myself. I hadn't noticed the man quietly sitting in the corner of the room, even though my entry into the room should have included him in plain sight. Kanta sat quietly smiling, with his hand placed lightly on his chest before moving into a wave that universally said, "Thank you, but no, I'm good." I could tell immediately that the man was accustomed to the opulence that surrounded us. He was well manicured with a fastidious precision. He had a freshly shaven look that belied the late afternoon hour, with hair combed to the left with a razor-straight part. Huey Lewis's Hip to be Square started playing on a loop in my head. His gaze shifted to me. His smile didn't touch his eyes. I turned back to Mr. Digby, who looked somewhat equally unsettled as he arranged paperwork into neat perpendicular piles on his desk. After some throat clearing, he started up, and after much legal speak and some signing of paperwork, he started to describe the assets that had been left to me. Once again, I found myself in a state of shock. I tried to break away from the spiraling torrent of thoughts that assaulted me, and realized after a short time that Mr. Digby had stopped speaking. The fog cleared a bit, and I asked him if he wouldn't mind repeating himself. There were 5 estates all told, 1 here in Devon and 4 others in California, Mexico, India, and Australia, a small private airport, several fishing and nautical vessels, holdings in multiple companies, and other assets that amounted to a net worth of $42 billion. My throat and mouth had gone dry, but hearing it a second time allowed me to absorb the information without becoming scatterbrained once more. I was hoping that the inheritance would be substantial, but this was on an order of magnitude that belied reality, and I was waiting to snap back to it, waking up in my studio apartment. But I didn't. He provided me with more documents. A company was being kept on retainer to manage my estate and finances, which I was thankful for because this paperwork seemed endless, and I had no idea what I was doing. Digby pulled out a final sheet of paper and listed the final item that I was to inherit. I signed the last document, and Digby stood up and led me through a door to another room. I looked back at Kanta to see him still sitting there with his smile stretched even tighter. As we walked, I asked Digby why Kanta was even there, but he just muttered something about ensuring contractual obligations. I entered a circular room devoid of any furniture with the exception of a single stone table at its center. On the table sat a trunk roughly the size of a large microwave. The trunk looked like it would have been comfortable in the hold of a pirate ship. It had a dark burgundy stain with thick brass straps and appointments. A tree symbol sat on a metallic plate on the edge of the trunk's lip, and in its center there was a keyhole. Digby furnished me with an old key. The key itself looked like a miniature whaling spear, with the edges of the bladed curve notched as a key might. Inserting the key into the lock, I spun it to discover that the plate turned with the key. Now, right side up, I realized that the tarnished image was not of a tree, but some many-tentacled squid. An inner mechanism clicked, and I was able to smoothly lift the lid on silent hinges. Delicate chains on the inside kept the lid from falling back too far. Within the trunk I found stacks of old leather-bound journals, all bearing the squid emblem, embossed in their center. There were several other metallic objects whose purpose I had not quite ascertained. There was a heavy metallic compass with exposed gearwork on its back end. Another object looked like some kind of nautical measuring apparatus. A sextant? I think. It had an old, polished look to it which suggested a lot of use, but the lenses were unscratched. It looked impossibly complex to operate. There was a rolled-up leather satchel that contained several black metallic rods of varying length and only a few inches in diameter. Each rod seemed extremely heavy, more so than the size should have allowed. And finally, there was what looked like some kind of ancient Rubik's Cube, or actually more like that evil demon cube from the Hellraiser movies. I tried delicately prying at it a bit, but nothing shifted or spun, and no gaping portals to hell opened up, so I decided to leave it for the time being. I looked a bit more and found an exposed letter folded into a pocket attached to the inside of the lid's center. As I removed the envelope, Mr. Digby cleared his throat and informed me that someone would come and carry the box to the waiting vehicle and would deliver me to my new residence. I stuffed the letter in my jacket pocket and followed him back to the office. Our friend Mr. Kanta had cleared out, and Mr. Digby appeared relieved at his absence. He had arranged for my accounts manager to meet with me the following morning and had me sign off on one last document that confirmed my agreement that all services had been rendered by Metro & Associates to my satisfactory completion. 2 men arrived and transported the chest, and I followed Mr. Digby downstairs to the awaiting car. Digby looked concerned, and as he shook my hand, I could tell that he felt conflicted about telling me something. "What is it?" I asked him. And after a continued shake of my hand, he sputtered a quick, "Nothing, Mr. Church. Nothing at all. Just be well. Be safe." "Safe from what?" I asked. But he released my hand and walked back inside. The doorman closed the door shut after him. I'd gotten in the back seat and the driver started off when I'd remembered the letter. I pulled it out and looked at the wax seal that fastened it shut, the same squid symbol my ancestors seemed fond of. After spending a few minutes delicately prying at the corners to try to keep the seal intact, I decided I was being foolish and decided to just snap the damn thing. I quickly scanned the bottom of the page and saw with a stylized flourish the signature of James Churchward. I returned my attention back to the top of the page and read the letter.
To whom it may concern. If you are reading this, by now you are most likely the beneficiary of my life's explorations and investments. Congratulations. I hope these meager funds translate into a solid return by the time you have adopted them. I've left my estate in good hands, with instructions on what industries should be invested in. You'll need these funds in the years to come. Additionally, I should mention to you that if you are reading this, you are the sole inheritor of my fortunes. As the youngest available inheritor that is still within the age of adulthood, as specified, the entirety of my fortune is left to you. I will have, as you may have come to learn, been deceased for some time now. Finally, I would like to provide you with a warning. For since you are reading this, that means the terms of the agreement have at last expired. The seals are broken. You will need to be prepared for what is to come. Through my journeys, I have discovered a secret that will change the world as we know it. The very ideas of creation itself are at jeopardy, and with that risk, there will be those that seek to protect the power they have gained. I have found the lost continent of Mu. And although I have released this knowledge to the public, there is a much greater story that I fear I have not been able to tell. Of all the inheritance you have received, the journals and artifacts in this chest are the most valuable, for they will guide you back to Mu, back to your destiny, and back to the task which needs resolution for the sake of all humanity. I wish you good luck. I encourage you to find the descendants of my fellow explorers to aid you in your journey, and I caution you, above all else, to be wary of who you place in your confidence. Sincerely, James Churchward.
I wasn't sure what to make of the letter. It all smacked of conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific nonsense. And what was the continent of Mu? Is it pronounced moo like a cow? I guess these were the last incoherent words of a man slipping into dementia before passing. A million questions flew through my mind, but the bedrock of my surety was, regardless of the ramblings in the letter, I had a lot to consider ahead of me. The shock of my newfound wealth hadn't worn off yet. As I considered what my next move would be, the car slowed to a stop in front of a beautiful ivy-covered estate. The driver got out and I followed him to the trunk, but he waved me off politely. He hefted the chest out of the car's trunk and led me up the stairs to the front entry. As he placed the chest down in front of him, he reached into his vest pocket and retrieved the key, informing me that he had several others to provide me. I realized that I'd left the letter in the back seat of the cab and let the man know to bring the trunk in and that I'd be right up. I jogged back down the stairs and made my way across the drive to the car, hearing the creak of the door opening behind me. A force blew me forward, knocking me violently down. The muted silence enveloped me, but was quickly consumed by thunderous roaring. I felt pain all over my back and reached up to the side of my ear to find blood trickling. I couldn't tell if it was coming from my ear or somewhere on my head. Rubble was strewn about, and a fine coating of dust had covered the black cab. I turned and looked to find the entryway of the estate on fire. A large hole where the door and most of the surrounding brickwork had been showed that the fire was spreading inward toward the belly of the house. I tried to stagger to my feet, but fell back down to my knees. A keening whine filled my right ear, and I looked through the haze of smoke and dust to discover that the driver was sprawled across the chest. He had fallen back onto it, and I unfortunately bore no hope that he had somehow lived, for both he and the chest itself were ablaze. The chest, I realized, and shambled forward as best I could. In the days to come I would reflect back on my initial reaction and feel guilt over my selfish consideration of the man's life. I would try to rationalize it to myself as having just been instinctual fight-or-flight reflex, but the truth was, in that moment, the chest became the only thing grounding me to the world and figuring out what I would do with my life from there on out. And there was my life, rapidly being consumed in flame. I grabbed the edge of the chest that was not yet burning and pulled at it. Slowly I moved it back toward me, increasing in speed as I reached the edge of the landing and the weight of the man fell off. With a final pull, the trunk fell forward, tumbling end over end, fluttering in flames as it crashed into the cobblestone walk, smashing apart and spilling its contents to the ground. I fell back with it, but painfully recovered myself to standing as I took off my jacket and smothered the flames, kicking journals away so that it wouldn't ignite the remaining pile. The manor was now fully ablaze, and I could hear sounds of sirens in the distance. I sat down there next to the smoldering ruin of my newly inherited home and watched the flames carry up to the second floor. As I sat, I thought of the letter and its vague, dire warnings. Maybe the old man wasn't tottering into dementia. Or maybe he was, but his words definitely had a truth to them. Something was going on. Something was at work here, and I had the sinking feeling that if I didn't find out what, soon I would come to the same end as the poor driver. The light of the approaching emergency vehicle spun vibrant reds and blues at the burning house, offset by the dust-colored sky. The letter was still in my hand, albeit crumpled and torn. I thought about the line in the letter, find the descendants of my fellow explorers, and determined that it was the most likely way to find the answers that I was looking for. I'd get the answers, and who knows, maybe I'd discover this lost continent and move.